Yeah, can you see my
Is it, say something again?
can you see my highlight?
Yes, everything is good.
Okay.
Yeah. What makes logic an art as opposed to a science? Well, um, I kind of wonder that myself, why she used the term art here. I guess it would mean more like it. Well, it's not why doesn't she use science if she considers ethics to be like a science in a sense, in a
You sound
broad
like a robot
sense?
now as well. It suits your background. I don't know what's wrong
Uh,
with them. Must be the connection.
should I reconnect, do you think?
No, it's fine now. It was just for a second
Okay.
there, you really sounded
Yeah.
like you're in a robot lab.
Logic is the art of non-contradictory identification. But I guess it's more of a stylistic choice.
Oh, okay. All right.
I really think it's just stylistic.
Okay. Well, I could go with that. Yeah, it's often said that way. Out of curiosity, what would you say distinguishes in general when you say something is an art as opposed to a science? And I don't mean fine arts or art,
I know what you
uh,
mean.
yeah, like the art of swordsmanship or the art of, I don't know, navigation. To me, I've always
I think
heard those kind of whenever I've heard that, I've been like, well, I couldn't make any sort of meaningful distinction. It's just art sounds nicer, that's all, because it connotes like, you know, Van
yeah,
Gogh painting something or whatever.
yeah. I mean, I think art's like kind of like techniques and styles more so than just merely a. That's just more a connotation thing. I'm not. I
Yeah,
can't think of a philosophical reason why she would
yeah,
use the word art here.
yeah.
I've seen that too, and it's like I know what she means in the connotation. It's getting off that sense of like um, some broad ways of thinking. That's just how I think of it. But
Okay.
logic just being our method of non-contradictory identification.
Yep. Okay. Cool. I'm happy to just skip that then.
Yeah, I wouldn't
Um,
make too much of it. Context, something I said.
so thinking is the application of logic. Is the application of logic always uh is thinking always the application of logic, or is it
No.
other? No, it's not. Okay. It's like what we discussed earlier, right? Recalling memories. Um,
Well, in this sense, a non-contradictory identification, like not only just recognizing a thing, but just saying like to say that's A is A and not A, or like an apple is not a pear, or just more in a direct way like that. Like you're identifying things as they are without just the methods of doing that, how you identify something as itself or as A rather than not A.
so what's that? Sorry.
Like just identifying things in a non-contradictory way, just to say that apples are apples but not pears, or like dogs are dogs but not cats. Like you're not, but also in a way identifying things that they don't contradict.
So that's
Just like a
logic, or
basic.
is that thinking? What were we?
Well, I'm saying that's logic
Oh, okay.
in particular as non-contradictory identification.
Yeah.
Thinking would be more broad, is not necessarily non-contradictory, or imagination isn't necessarily non-contradictory because you're coming up with things that contradict reality.
Potentially.
Or
But
yeah,
yeah.
potentially.
So you're saying thinking includes imagination.
It can, I'm saying.
Okay. Or yeah,
But
yeah, that's what I
logic
mean.
is
Like, okay.
and
I'm just
logic is
trying to
more
get the
narrow.
concept. Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
logic being more narrow. And that's how Rand usually uses logic, and just pretty general, but just narrow enough that it's the ways of identifying what is consistent with the reality and identifying contradictions where they might be. But then we could have thinking, which might include other aspects like, you know, recollection or imagination, or because thinking about counterfactuals, you could, in a way, say that's could be logical thinking as well. Um, but yeah, thinking can include more than logic. That's all. Because you can think in wrong ways that would be illogical. That's all.
Right. With the example of something you imagine as being contradictory, but overall the process. Anyway, maybe that's a more detailed question, but
Yeah, I would get rid of the counterfactual part actually, because I realized when I said it, that wasn't a good example. Because counterfactuals still use logic within their internal structure at least, but yeah, not all thinking is logic.
give
That's
me an what do you mean counterfact? Can you give me an example?
well, if a counterfactual, like imagine the world was um, like imagine that we lived on Mars instead of Earth or something, or imagine that um, I had two heads instead of one or something. It's just anything that's not how reality is. But then you could think logically from there, assuming that were true, what would it imply? Or assuming that I had psychic powers, what would that imply about, say, ethics or anything like that?
Okay.
Even though it's, of course, not going to happen, but if it were true, then you could apply it logically. You're thinking logically.
On the terms existence versus reality, when they're mentioned, it seems like if I got this right, existence, when they say like existence, it's just used to differentiate thoughts, consciousness from thoughts and from the things outside, which they call existence. In philosophy, or at least in this text, it seems that that's when existence is used, is to just to, it's the same thing as reality, but it's more, the connotation is more existence is when you want to sort of talk about consciousness and you want to go, okay, there's this thing, consciousness, and it has thoughts, and then there's existence, which is outside of it. And then reality is just everything. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I don't think there's any real conceptual distinction. So whatever the connotation difference is would be
Oh,
fine. They
okay.
still refer to the same thing.
Yeah, okay.
Like we were talking about synonyms before. It's like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can see where you would use existence or reality, like, but they're the same thing.
All right, let's go to the context section. I'm not quoting Peacock anymore here. Uh, I'm quoting some guy off of an internet forum. All right. So, uh, we did touched a bit on this, but maybe we can pick it up again since this whole section
Yes.
is on context. Um, you said context is everything connected to what you refer to when you use a concept or idea, and I want to know which because I asked you and you didn't, you still were not sure, and I wasn't sure either. Well, like, what is this connection? If context is everything connected to it, um, like I said, it can't be everything since the context of boiling water is also existence, logic, volition, all that. But like, obviously, there's a point where you go, well, you can't say it's everything because so context can't be everything because then it's not useful as a term. And so I'm trying to figure out how do I work out what actually is a context?
Okay,
Like
so
in
I
any
can,
given situation. If you are explicit about this, I think the benefit would be when you're thinking about even communicating with other people, you'd be able to better frame how to think about it, right?
yeah. So I'd probably be more precise about what I wrote here. So I said context is everything connected to what you referred to. Um, that might not be the best way to put it. So the thing you're referring to, the context, could be your just where you're trying to focus. It could also depend how you could, there's a context which you could apply your reference. So if you're referring to
What would
boiling
you?
water,
Yeah, okay.
yeah, like it's within reality, but then you also know there's other things, it's within, say, a kitchen. And some concepts, you've generalized to apply to almost to literally everything that you've ever seen. Like logic, I mean, that applies everywhere, or causality applies everywhere. because you've generalized it to that extent. You've realized that the context literally is every single location in existence. Like that's universal in a sense that it applies everywhere at all times. Because like, well, that's a matter of induction. Like you've learned over time that it can be generalized to everywhere. But context here would be like, okay, you focus on, at least right now, where you know the context is, at least spatially. Like you know it's here right now in this moment. It works this way. And that's part of the context where you might initially start, and you can know how that might vary over other. You can widen the context and to change the constraint of what you're thinking about. They could say, oh, you could say, I'll talk about boiling water in, you could even assume, say, boiling water, 100 degrees Celsius on Earth, always. And then you could use that as a way to constrain your thinking. Like, okay, you're trying to understand boiling water in terms of on Earth. And at first you might see like, oh, it's 100 degrees Celsius at, I don't know, in London, New York City, and Berlin. You could say, oh, there's 100 degrees there. And say, oh, yeah, maybe I should generalize the context too. I should maintain the context as like these countries, even the whole world. But then you might go to Denver, Colorado, and see, well, it's not 100 degrees Celsius anymore. And you could say, well, one thing that has changed about the context, or one thing you might think is the context, is like, oh, it's altitude. Or you could say it's distance from the ocean. Like maybe you might not know which one it is, but you would know that the context couldn't be like the whole world anymore. It's got to be constrained in some way. Like, or maybe the context only went to the context of those places. It's more a matter of trying to figure out where your focus is. You don't want to be too broad or too narrow.
Uh, uh, if you say context is where your focus is or should be, that already assumes that's the same thing as saying context is where to me, context is where the context is or should be. Like, because it would be the same. What I'm thinking as you say that is maybe it's do you think it's something to do with like lack a gap in knowledge? Because you're saying in this case, obviously we already know maybe altitude affects water at boiling point, but let's assume this whole discussion only comes up when you don't know, right? I mean, that's what I think. Like when you don't know and you're trying to figure it out. Um, the reason I'm saying that because I'm thinking about, okay, I just thought about context when I've heard the term elsewhere. It's like usually if you're talking to someone and you say something and they say, "Oh, that's out of like that didn't make any sense. It's out of context." The what the meaning of that is that there is some bits of knowledge they're missing for it to be logical for you to say what you said. And so in that case, it's an example of like context is capturing a gap in knowledge. Would you say it would be there may be something similar here with this, although it's harder to see in this boiling point of water thing, like
I mean, when you have, I wouldn't say so much gaps in knowledge, as much context is just whatever space and time and actual space where
space in
your
time.
space and like being now and in your room or whatever it might be. Like now being like 3:22 p.m. Eastern time.
Yeah.
And I mean that would be a way of thinking of your context, just where you are.
Time and
And
place.
yeah, time and place really. I wouldn't think of it as too much more than time and place. That I mean, you're right. It would be hard to decide what exactly is the context. You do want to know how to constrain your thinking. I mean, it could be a matter of what you want to focus on. You could say you can constrain your entire context to merely in Australia if you wanted for whatever reason. I mean, that might have to do with like you're trying to understand, say,
But
legal proceedings in Australia and whatnot, and you can just select that as your context where to constrain your thinking. Or on the other hand, if you are trying to understand, say, the laws of physics, you might want to constrain the context to Earth, for instance, and that can constrain your thinking, and you can see Like that's just the bounds of what you want to refer to. And anything outside of that is not what you're referring to.
Oh, okay. All right. So that kind of goes against the idea that it refers to something that's a gap in knowledge. But to select, yeah, it's something to think about more because to select, you've said it's what you want to select. That to me, that is context. So context is context. It's kind of circular. I still don't really get like how do I know what methodically like what is a context in every given context?
I mean, I
It's
guess you
like
could say there's subcontexts. Like you got the context of existence, and there's things that apply to that, like causality. But then you could say, well, as for this one thing within existence, I want to focus on, say, just how, I don't know, rocks fall or something. And you could say, like, okay, I'm going to keep those things that apply to every context, like causality um, and identity. And then you can narrow it to just that I'm going to focus on these particulars I see, like these things that I call rocks. And you could come up with different rules about rocks and how they work because you're focusing on rocks, but then you could discover more things that could create even more subcontext. Like not only are they rocks, but you can distinguish if does some come from volcanoes or do some come from just the river. I mean, that could be a subcontext. You could say that, okay, now I know what rocks do, but then there's other contexts I can consider rocks. And like, if I consider just rocks and water, that will be something different than rocks and volcanoes.
although I'm still left puzzled with the method of like
Select.
like because you're saying it's what you choose to focus on, but then let's go back to that. For me, this is a simpler scenario. If you're in a conversation with someone and you say something that's out of context, like it wouldn't just be a matter of selecting what you want to focus on. There's more to when you say a conversation where you say something that is in context, right? More than just selecting what you want to focus on. There's like in that case, there is something about it. Does this person have the knowledge that is? But this is confusing. It's more that this like if you say something that's in context, it means you're saying something that the person has the knowledge to understand. But then that would mean they have I don't know, man. This is confusing. They would
When
have
you
the
say
context.
you say something out of context, I just think that means you've overextended what you're supposed to refer to. I mean, you don't want to. If you say something out of context, you're saying out of the situation which it occurred in. Like you took it out of the context and put it into a new one out of nowhere. Like you can't just take something out of a context and put it in a new one.
So what is
That's
the
taking it out
context
of.
then?
I mean, the
What?
context should be how things, like where things occurred in time and space. Like it just the context, like in the here and now, or just where things occurred. I mean, that's maybe the best way I can put it. Like, or you could even think maybe I'll try one more example. It's like physics. You could at one point people thought physics, like Newton physics, would just focus on I don't know how things fall and move and what applies on Earth should apply everywhere. But over time, by Einstein, we figured out that outside of Earth, things don't necessarily operate that same way. So we had to alter the context, like say, realize that the context was Earth, and that's more like a subcontext of whatever else would be out there. So I wouldn't focus too much on when people say claim something is set out of context. It's more like just taking it out of the context it was made for. Like you can't start talking about rocks and start suddenly talking about how planets work. I mean, you could say, oh, planets are big rocks, therefore I can talk about planets like rocks, but it's like that's out of context. It's like rocks are supposed to be like these things, smaller things we find in Earth. We're not referring to the big things that go around the sun. And that's kind of like taking something out of context because I mean, they're different things just on the perceptual level. And of course, selecting, what to focus on is really a huge issue. But you can trust that you generally know what different ways to identifying context. Like, does that make sense?
I'm still pretty confused, to be honest. I think this is it's a difficult thing
Okay.
to get down to a precise formulation, right? Like, I get some
Yeah.
of what you're saying. I guess I would say, maybe it's based on what you're saying, it's like, it's those, so, well, now it kind of conflicts with what Peikoff was saying, but it was like the things you choose to focus on, or holding in mind when considering a certain topic or thought. But, Peikoff says it's the things that condition a thought. So that could be things that you aren't holding in mind too, right? Like, I'm just struggling to really get a formulation of what are these boundaries exactly that make something a context. It is interesting because we use I'm using the concept all the time, but I can't even pinpoint what it is. So, um, maybe it's something to come back to since I'm
Yes.
stuck, and I'll think about it more, and then I could even put a post up about it or something where I just, after I think about it for a bit longer, because I'm not getting anywhere, so I don't want
Yeah,
to
we
spend.
can. Yeah,
Yeah,
we'll keep going.
yeah, cool. Um, let's see. This whole section is on context anyway, so
Yes.
it's fine. All right,
Concepts
let's.
are a relational form of knowledge.
Yep, I'll just see. In other words, concepts are formed in a context by relating concretes to a field of contrasting entities. This body of relationships, which constitutes the context of the concept, is what determines its meaning. Um, okay, so all concepts are relational. Um, Oh yeah, so I was like, are axiomatic concepts a context as well? Because they're not relational, they're starting points. But then how do they relate to this description here of like, concepts?
I mean, you're relating all things you see. You're relating everything you ever see together. That's all.
What do you mean?
I mean, it's relating every concept, every thing in reality to every other thing in reality.
The
That's why that,
axiomatic concepts?
yeah, because they refer to every single thing there is. Like identity applies to every single concrete in the world.
So there is that in terms of, oh, but that's not a contrasting entity though, right?
No, it's not contrasting. I wouldn't say.
It's just
I
a
mean, that is a
similarity.
more narrow question. I do recall some other ways of considering this question of how you form axiomatic concepts if you're technically not like referring to differences as much because, well, I guess you are. You're the measurement you're omitting is everything except its existence. Like you've omitted every single measurement
Yeah.
except its mere existence, and you could say that's existence. Like you've omitted every single measurement possible
So the contrasting
except its
entity is
existence.
non-existence, which doesn't exist.
It's hard to say for this one because is there a contrasting entity? Well, can you contrast existence with non-existence? Not really. So I think with axiomatic concepts, we would need to go about something differently, but it is relational, at least I would say, because it applies to everything, but there must be a different way to form axiomatic concepts in this part. I
Okay.
remember that question elsewhere.
Oh wow. Okay, cool. Do you reckon it'll be on the forum as well?
For some reason, I think so.
Okay, cool. I'll just write that down. And then maybe I can do some more thinking about it and come back to it. I can see how philosophy can actually be difficult. You can approach it just by kind of like superficially going over these concepts and going, yeah, that makes sense, but not actually connecting it to anything. But when you try and connect it to stuff, you're just left completely puzzled.
I mean, I would say for sure the axiomatic concepts are special cases that we can't necessarily generalize from other things we know about concepts because of how unique of a presence they hold for logic and the foundation of thinking here. So they will have some different aspects to them. Like it's a special case of concept formation, as opposed to the general case, which is always relational forms of knowledge and blah, blah, blah.
Can I ask you, do you know when you read something like this that I'm highlighting now, uh, when you read this, can you immediately think of an example that comes to mind? I can't personally. Like, there's nothing in my mind that go, oh yeah, of course. There's a relational I relate concretes to a field of contrasting entities. Like, I remember the concept in the abstract, but I can't. Like, nothing immediately comes to mind when I look at that. I'm like, I don't have examples or anything. Do you?
Um, well, as far as the relating concretes, a lot of that's kind of implicit, it just kind of happens and you do it habitually or automatically in a sense. You just kind of do it when you're there. Like when we're talking about forming concepts, thinking of childhood is the only context I really go to when I think about that. We're talking about forming them. Really, the most obvious cases of forming concepts are like a child forming a concept of the color red, for example.
Yeah.
And you form that concept in the context of, say, in your house and what your parents show you. I mean, that's all you get really is your stimuli or your evidence of outside of yourself. Then that's what you get to learn about, like just some of these different toys your parents show you. And that way you're relating the different things you've been shown within that context of like your home and things like that. And you might eventually learn that like, oh, this certain color is called red because I've been given these various entities, like some blue ones, some green ones, some purple ones, then the red ones. Like it's more than just having the red things.
You've gone
Like,
super robotic just now.
sorry, I don't know what
Okay.
that could be.
Oh, it's fine now. Yeah, I was just letting you know, but it's fine now. Yeah.
But the key thing is, I mean, there's contrast. Like you'll have blue things, you'll have red things, and you need both of those things to differentiate and then integrate and all that stuff. But you're relating those things that are different and the things that are similar.
How is it possible that they're like sh how is it that we've just surely there are tons more concepts we should be forming if an example of that would be I can't even pinpoint what context is. So like if we're talking about forming concepts. Anyway, I don't my point was I don't have examples for that. I was just curious if you had like live examples or from overstretching and it's not, I don't know if I'm looking for the right thing here, but when I was thinking when I'm reading this, I should be able to give examples. It shouldn't be just this abstract, but not examples that are from someone else's context, but from my own, because I can't think of.
I would try to simplify what you think about context. I think you might be, I'm not sure about this, you might be making it more, thinking it's more complicated than it actually is. I'm not sure though.
Okay. Well, I guess we'll find out as I do more and more work on this and like if it's makes sense or not. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah. I mean, really just the point of this part is just saying like you have different things in reality you refer to. They can have different red objects and different blue objects, and you relate them together. You perceive them, and you see their similarities and the differences, things
yeah,
like that. Just where you are, you're not a baby's probably not going to be thinking about, well, what's it going to look like when I go to school? Like, well, they don't. School isn't part of what they're thinking. It's not part of their life, not part of the context of these objects they are looking at.
yeah. Okay. Let's just I can come back. I've blued stuff that I'm gonna come back to anyway, like myself,
Yeah,
and then can always
yeah.
go
Well,
go.
continue on
Yeah. All right, let me skip down to this is about roles. I don't know if you remember this, but
a little bit about roles.
I
Yes.
read this and I was like, I sort of get what's being said, but I'm still pretty puzzled. Like, so he said, just as a quotation can be used out of context, so can a concept. That I understand. Here
Yes.
is a real life example taken from A Theory of Justice, the well-known book by Harvard philosopher John Rawls. He says, nobody worked to achieve his own grey matter. Nobody earned his brain, which is a mere gift from nature. This monstrous theory drops the context of the concept earn. And then I'm going to the next bolded part. There is no such thing as working to achieve one's brain. Who is working and by what means? And I was like, isn't that the point though? That there's no like, okay, maybe the concept earn doesn't fit in, but what he's saying is that we don't, not everything is in our volitional control. Like we didn't, if there is genetic intelligence and some people have more than others, that's not something they control. I kind of missed Peikoff's point here. Like,
Well, it's the concept earn. It's not the idea that there's some things we don't earn, some things we do. It's like we had to achieve his brain, which is a mere gift. I mean, that doesn't even seem right. Earning doesn't have anything to do with like what you're born with anyway. Like, let me just reread this real quick.
yeah, that's fine.
Um,
So it's distributing,
I mean, I think Rawls
sacrificing.
is just making the argument because we don't earn our brain that our products of the brain shouldn't be earned either. Because if you can't earn your mind, then how can you earn the consequences of using your mind? I mean, I think that's kind of what Peikoff is trying to say here, and that Rawls is misunderstanding or deliberately misleading on what it to earn. Like he's trying to make a strange argument by taking earn and then trying to apply it to things that you haven't chosen already. Like, um, there is no such thing as working to achieve one's brain. Who is working and by what means?
I'm still like I sort of get it, but it's still pretty unclear. Like, because in my mind I read that I'm like, yeah, it makes sense. Like, I don't earn to, I don't earn my brain. But then, he's saying, okay, I get it. He's saying that concept is formed, you know, in a specific context. I guess maybe I'm not familiar with the context, so what he's saying doesn't then make like I'm still left like, well, Rawls does have a point. Like we didn't it's not like by free will we've chosen to have our intelligence. And if our
Right.
intelligence does lead us to be more productive, but it's not because of um it's like I guess there's a couple of things in here. So one is like there's stuff for me to think about, but two, if this is how I think, then I'm pretty sure whatever Peikoff's argument wouldn't work on anyone else unless they're already thinking very objectively or in this specific method. They wouldn't be like, yeah, well, I don't know what any of that. Most people would probably go, what are you talking about? Like you don't earn to achieve your brain. The argument wouldn't even, his point wouldn't penetrate through anything because it's like it seems to rely on this new method of thinking.
Yeah, when I'm
Not, and
looking
I'm
at
not saying that
this,
he's wrong. I'm just saying that I like my struggle in understanding why what he's saying is so obviously true is
when I'm
like an
looking at
example.
this, it seems like the reason that Rawls is saying it's nobody earns anything
Their
is
brains.
I mean he's trying to show, well, no, you can't use earn for anything. Like he's trying to say earn is a stupid concept. That's what Rawls seems to be saying. And then Peikoff is agreeing, yeah, when you use earn this way, you make it a stupid concept. Like it's like seems like, yeah, Peikoff, you agree. It's just you disagree on the logical conclusion. And I'm not sure I would even say that Peikoff is fairly interpreting Rawls. I mean, I know Rawls does have very negative implications, and I think his logic is wrong, but I don't think it's wrong for this reason. And it seems this to me, it would seem like it is in context, but he is because he's trying to invalidate Earn. And Peikoff is trying to say, well, this would invalidate Earn. Well, yeah, it does. That's what Rawls thinks too. But Peikoff seems to be saying that we can maintain the concept Earn once we do try to distinguish between the way we use what we've been given. We're not trying to think about Earn as just like, oh, you got a thing. We're trying to think of Earn as like some people do things with what they're given and others don't.
Um, yeah, the reason why I try to pick on this is there's a couple of reasons, but one of them is also like if you try and it's quite difficult. Like okay, if I've studied lots of epistemology and I've done rearranging of concepts, it might be obvious, but try and explain this to someone else in terms that would make sense to them. Like I don't even know how you do that because like an example would be emotional safety, meaning if someone is offended that there's been some, like everyone is entitled to emotional safety because if they're offended, everyone should be safe and like safe means non-violence. And then try and like untangle that in like if you apply his same method of explanation, which makes sense if you have the whole epistemology, but try and explain that to anyone else, and it's like to me it's impossible. Um, yeah. What do you have any thoughts on that? Like, how do you illustrate that something like this doesn't make sense through a simple analogy or metaphor? Because I couldn't think of
When I'm thinking about
like
this, I feel like Peikoff is strawmanning Rawls. Like I agree Rawls is wrong, but I think he's strawmanning the argument through this overly simplistic example. I'm
okay,
not sure I even like this. Now that I've been reading it more, it's just like, yeah, I know Rawls is wrong, but I don't think this analysis is working for it.
okay,
It's like, yeah, like that's what Rawls is trying to talk about. He's trying to say, do we actually choose to, does it matter to distinguish between how we choose to use what we're born with or not? And Rawls is probably going to say, like, no, we can't, there is no meaningful way to distinguish this. And he does make later arguments why he believes that is the case. And he's wrong about them, I think, but I don't think Peikoff is giving him a fair argument. I think he oversimplified the example.
yeah. I mean, I've heard people make the case, like successful people somewhere. I vaguely remember someone saying, like, well, I didn't choose to be born here. They didn't use I didn't earn this. They used I didn't choose to be born here. I didn't choose my brain, which is the same. So they go with this same idea, but they just use the word choose. And then what would Peikoff say to that? Like he can't say, well, choose is only within a certain context because it's true that it's non-volitional. You don't choose your brain or choose where you're born.
Yeah,
Anyway,
yeah, I find issues with this one too. Like it's
all right,
not. I don't think it's a good example on Peikoff's part.
all right. Well, I guess it's still something I wanted to explore,
Yes,
so let me just blew it.
the
All right,
concept
next.
out of context. Yes.
Um, okay. This is more of this context stuff that is like ridiculous. But human knowledge is relational. It is an organization of elements, each relevant to and bearing on the others. Knowledge is not a juxtaposition of independent items, it is a unity. And there are more sections here that are separate. Metaphysically, there is only one universe. That means that everything in reality is interconnected. Every entity is related in some way to the others. Each somehow affects and is affected by others. Anyway, you kind of get where this is going.
Yeah.
Um, must be a total. All right, that's contextual integration. And then so, yeah, like then I'm like, okay, well, this.
Yeah. What would it mean then?
To relate, you know,
Sorry.
oh, good. So, what
Here.
would it mean then for me to relate like physics to a crocodile? I just don't see what does it mean everything is reality is interconnected. Every entity is related, somehow is affected by others. Like physics to a crocodile or my love for someone to my computer keyboard. Like I don't. They're just.
I
I
mean,
don't.
there are very broad things to connect. I mean, it's more than just say what a crocodile does. Like they eat an animal can have like a chaos effect from there. Like each little thing affects another. It's more than that. It's more maybe like the way physics works can relate to even how crocodiles move, or physics can relate directly to how crocodiles open their mouth and you get enough power to chomp down. It's relating, like knowledge has some bearing on everything else in some way. Like what you know about physics will have a bearing on what you know about crocodiles, and crocodiles don't exist outside of physics. Or love for a person, love with um, a keyword, like knowing you love a person, knowing you love a keyword that can relate in ways like how does the love between these two things differ? How is it the same? You're relating two applications of a concept to two different things. Um, and it just everything is applied in a different way.
Okay. Well, what about each somehow is affected and is affects and is affected by others? So how does my keyboard affect my love for someone else? Like that's where my mind went, and I was just like, well, I don't. That doesn't make sense.
I mean, you could think of it like um, what you know about love for a keyboard can affect what you know about love for a person. Like, what is it that you love about a keyboard? You could say, I don't know, it's just the keys make a nice sound. Why do you love a person? It's like you like their sense of humor. I mean, things like that. You can relate those things, and what you know about love can is affected. Like
But
if what you know about loving a keyboard changes, like if you realize somehow, oh, the keyboard's conscious, it has a personality too. It's like, well, that knowledge will affect maybe how I think about love of people, like things like that.
it's not like my keyboard affects some person I love because every entity is related to some in some way to the other. So it's not the knowledge of the entity, it's the entity, which made me think of the butterfly effect of, this whole thing
Yeah.
of like butterfly flaps its wing in Africa and a avalanche falls down in Nepal or something.
Yeah, but I think even knowledge here, just strictly in the knowledge conceptual sense, is also just interconnecting. And the way that, say, the like what you know about the axioms affects what you would know about, say, cooking or something. Like because it has a bearing on everything else. It has a bearing in somewhere along the line, the same way physics has a bearing on somewhere along the line of how crocodiles move or how waterfalls fall. I mean, different things like that. I mean, what you know about physics will change what you therefore know about waterfalls and crocodiles. It might change it in a small way,
Right.
but it's not like crocodiles exist in a vacuum away from
Right.
physics outside of Earth, outside of ecosystems. Like crocodiles, you need to know, well, how does the water cycle and the ecosystem and requirements of life, and then the physical requirements as a moving animal, or the cognitive needs for the crocodile to function. Like what you know about animals will affect what you know about crocodiles, or even all sorts of ways that what you know about one thing will affect what you know about crocodiles.
Would you say knowledge is an entity? In this context, you're saying every entity. Is knowledge an entity? Is like, for example, love an emotion? Is that an entity?
I think he's saying both. Entities as in the thing, physical things, and then knowledge is therefore affected. If every entity is affected, also therefore knowledge is also affected.
Well, it's just so every okay. So you say entity, and knowledge isn't an entity though. It's knowledge
No,
is.
isn't existent to be specific. Existent is like includes things that are physical and non-physical, like
Well,
knowledge.
okay, an entity is a physical thing.
is like the thing you see, yes, the
Mm,
object. And saying
okay.
from that fact, we know that knowledge must also be a total. It must be interconnected with other knowledge as well, in the same way that
Well,
entities are connected.
your examples I get with the all your examples were of knowledge being
Right,
relational. So like knowledge of
right.
physics being able to be related to knowledge of a crocodile, but not
Yeah,
to necessarily to the oh well I guess that they're dissimilar in that knowledge physics is a field of knowledge whereas crocodile is an entity. But let's then go with entity to entity. How does how do you relate to a crocodile in Africa? That's because that's
that's
how I
harder
interpreted
because
this. That's
that
right.
one's
Entity.
very broad and abstract, so it's not like the most useful information, but I know we're both animals on Earth and but life on Earth and what I know about life on Earth well I should get rid of the word know because I'm trying to say in terms of entities how they relate.
Well, how are you affected by it? It says, at least if I take this literally, how I've read it, then that's what it would mean, that you have some impact on a crocodile in Africa, which has some impact on a workman in Xinjiang province in China.
I mean, we could think of it like somebody in China has a company that collects crocodile meat and exports it to America. I mean, that's a very indirect way, but like, or the desire for meat can affect the way it's acquired. That
It's a
if I want
stretch.
crocodile meat, somebody, yeah, but that's kind of like what an economic
Yeah,
thing
it's the
is.
butterfly effect too, though, which I
Yes.
don't see as I've heard that, and I guess it's like some people see it as encouraging, and I can understand why, but I just can't believe it. Like, that every little act you might do, the encouraging takeaway for people is that, and I guess if it was true for me, it would be every little thing you can do can like perpetuate and have a massive impact, and you don't know it. Like one kind act, can affect some person in Botswana or something like that. But I
Yeah.
just don't buy into it, and I don't buy into this either. So,
Well, and
because
not
I
really,
don't
I
see
wouldn't
it.
say a big effect. I do recall Peikoff addressing this specifically,
Oh,
and
okay.
I think objectivism through induction. He addressed this specifically with a really good example about
Really? Cool.
airplanes. Yes, that was an actually really good example. I should review that again myself because it was
We'll
a
be
good
doing
example making it clear.
Okay, I'll
Makes it very
definitely.
clear.
My order was this, then the epistemology book. Then I'll get onto those two courses, the
Yeah.
through induction and unity in epistemology and ethics. I can go over them and ask questions then. All right, cool. So it's not really clear, but that's okay. There was a lot here that's pretty. This is pretty difficult.
I know
Um,
I wouldn't worry too much about your struggle with what context is. I mean, I think that's maybe one of the more difficult things to get, but then when you get it, it like makes every so much more make sense.
right,
Like, I mean, it is a lot of how I think the epistemology works in objectivism. What is context? I think when you can answer that clearly, then you probably understood everything by that
right,
point.
right. Okay. Yeah, well, I mean, stuff, we can, like you said earlier, you might find because this is not the book is set out in a logical order, but not necessarily a chronological order that you'd like actually learn the concepts through. So I
Right.
might find as I get to latter sections, I can come back. You use the words term spiral. I can spiral back, and then, this blue stuff will make more
Yes.
sense. But right now, to be honest, it doesn't make much sense. So. Um, cool. Maybe we'll just go to the next. Actually, let's almost. Let me just end the recording.
Sure.